When indigenous leader Kawal heard the forest spirit's urgent whisper in his dreams, he knew that either his people would heed the ancient call, or their ancestral homeland would be lost forever. Kawal Yanomami had always been able to hear the forest's voice, but he had never heard it cry out in pain until the night the bulldozers came within 20 kilometers of his village. The 35-year-old leader of the Tapiri community had inherited more than just the responsibility of guiding his people. He carried the spiritual gift of his grandmother, who could communicate with the protective spirits that dwelled in every tree, every stream, and every breath of wind that moved through their ancestral territory in the heart of the Amazon rainforest. The dream that changed everything came to him just before dawn on a Tuesday in March. In the vision, Kawal found himself standing in a vast clearing where ancient trees lay fallen like the bones of giants, their massive trunks scarred by the teeth of machines he had only seen in photographs. The spirit of the forest appeared to him as his grandmother had always described, a figure of shifting green light that seemed to be composed of every living thing that called the rainforest home. But this time, the spirit's usual serene presence was replaced by an urgency that made Kawal's heart race even in sleep. The destroyers come with papers that say they own what cannot be owned, the spirit told him, its voice like wind through leaves mixed with the distant cry of endangered animals. They bring machines that drink oil and breathe poison, and they do not understand that when the last tree falls, their papers will mean nothing. But there is still time, if your people are willing to make the journey to the heart place where the old agreements were made. The spirit gestured toward a direction Kawal had never traveled, deeper into the forest than even the most experienced hunters of his village had ever ventured. When Kawal woke, he could still feel the spirit's presence lingering in the morning air like the memory of smoke from a sacred fire. He knew from his grandmother's teachings that such dreams were not mere visions, but actual communications from the beings who had protected his people for thousands of years. The urgency in the spirit's voice told him that the threat to their land was immediate and real, and that conventional methods of resistance, appeals to government officials, legal challenges, and media campaigns would not be enough to save their ancestral home. Within hours of his awakening, Kawal's worst fears were confirmed. His cousin Roberto, who worked as a liaison with environmental organizations in the nearest city, arrived at the village with news that made the elders' blood run cold. A multinational corporation had purchased logging rights to a massive tract of land that included not only their traditional territory, but also the headwaters of the river that provided life to dozens of indigenous communities downstream. The paperwork was legal, the contracts were signed, and the first wave of clearing was scheduled to begin within the month. But Kawal also carried hope, because the forest spirit had not just warned him of danger, it had offered a solution. The heart place the spirit had mentioned was spoken of in the oldest stories of his people, a sacred site where the first agreements between humans and the forest had been made in the time before memory. If such a place truly existed, and if his people could reach it and renew those ancient compacts, perhaps there was still a way to protect their homeland that went beyond the laws of the modern world. Convincing the village to undertake a spiritual journey into uncharted forest proved more challenging than Kawal had anticipated. The Tapiri community had lived in the same location for 4 generations, and many of the younger members had adopted a more practical approach to dealing with outside threats. During the evening council meeting, voices rose in heated debate around the central fire as Kawal shared his vision and proposed the journey to the heart place. "We should be organizing protests in Brasilia, not chasing spirits through the jungle," argued his nephew Carlos, who had spent 2 years studying environmental law in the city. "We have lawyers willing to fight for us, journalists who want to tell our story. The world is watching what happens to indigenous rights in Brazil right now." Carlos represented a growing faction of younger community members who believed their salvation lay in engaging with the modern legal and political systems, rather than relying on traditional spiritual practices. But Kawal's Aunt Marina, the village's eldest woman and keeper of traditional medicines, supported the spiritual approach. "The lawyers and journalists failed to stop the mining companies in the Kayapo territory," she reminded the group, her weathered hands gesturing toward the forest darkness beyond their fire. They failed to protect the sacred sites of the Guarani people. The spirits protected us long before there were courts and constitutions, and they are our strongest allies now. Her words carried the weight of decades of experience watching outside. Authorities promised protection that never materialized. The debate continued for 3 days, with the community deeply divided between those who wanted to trust in modern legal protections and those who believed their survival depended on honoring the old ways. Kawan found himself caught between two worlds. His education had taught him the value of documentation, media attention, and legal advocacy. But his spiritual training told him that some battles could only be fought on the plane where his ancestors had always engaged with the forces that truly controlled their destiny. The decision came when 8-year-old Yana, Marina's granddaughter, approached the council fire on the third night and spoke with a clarity that silenced the debate. "I dreamed of the tree spirits too," she said, in a voice that seemed too mature for her small frame. "They showed me what happens if we don't go to the heart place. The river turns black, the animals disappear, and our children forget how to hear the forest's voice. But they also showed me what happens if we do make the journey. The trees teach us how to protect themselves in ways the destroyers can never overcome." Kawan felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized the same spiritual gift in his young cousin that his grandmother had possessed. The child's dream, combined with her natural innocence and the respect the community held for her, Grandmother Marina, tipped the balance in favor of the spiritual journey. By dawn, 12 adults and 3 children had volunteered to make the trek into the deepest part of the forest, carrying with them the hopes and fears of their entire community. The preparations took a week, during which the village's shamans conducted purification ceremonies and gathered the sacred plants that would help the travelers maintain their spiritual connection during the journey. Roberto returned to the city to continue legal efforts and coordinate with environmental groups, ensuring that the community's struggle would be documented regardless of the outcome of the spiritual quest. As the journey party prepared to depart, Kawan realized they were embarking on more than just a physical trek through dangerous territory. They were attempting to bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern crisis, seeking solutions that honored both their cultural heritage and the urgent realities of the contemporary world. The journey into the forest's interior began at dawn, with the travelers following animal paths and watercourses that led deeper into territory that had been untouched by human presence for centuries. Kawan led the group with the guidance of the forest spirit, whose presence he could feel as a gentle tugging sensation that directed him toward hidden trails and safe river crossings. The forest seemed to respond to their spiritual purpose, with jaguar tracks appearing in the mud to mark safe passages and colorful birds calling out warnings when dangerous areas lay ahead. Marina walked beside young Yana, teaching the child to read the subtle signs that indicated they were moving through sacred space. "Look how the trees grow here," she whispered, pointing to massive cecropia and Brazil nut trees that formed natural cathedrals with their interwoven canopies. "They've been arranged by the spirits to create places of power where the energy flows strongest. Your grandmother taught me to recognize these patterns when I was your age." The old woman's knowledge proved invaluable as they navigated through areas where conventional maps and GPS devices were useless. On the second day, they encountered their first sign that they were approaching something extraordinary. The air itself seemed to change, becoming thicker and more charged with an energy that made the travelers' skin tingle and their dreams more vivid. The plants around them grew larger and more vibrant than anything they had seen in their home territory, with flowers that seemed to glow with their own internal light and vines that moved with an almost sentient grace. Even the skeptical members of the group began to acknowledge that they were entering a realm where the normal rules of the natural world didn't apply. The true test of their spiritual preparation came on the third night, when the forest spirits decided to evaluate whether the travelers were worthy of reaching the heart place. As the group slept in hammocks strung between ancient trees, each member experienced intense dreams that forced them to confront their deepest fears and motivations. Kawan found himself reliving every moment of doubt he had ever experienced about his leadership abilities, while Marina faced visions of her village burning and her people scattered to the winds. Even little Yana was tested, shown images of a future where children grew up without any connection to the natural world. But the dreams also revealed the travelers' true strength and purpose. Those who remained committed to protecting their people and their land found themselves receiving knowledge and abilities that would help them in the trials ahead. Kawan discovered that he could communicate not just with the forest spirit, but with individual trees and animals, learning the secret language that all living things shared. Marina gained the ability to see the spiritual essence of plants and animals, understanding their roles in the complex web of relationships that maintained the forest's balance. When dawn broke on the fourth day, the entire group had been transformed by their spiritual trials. They moved through the forest with a confidence and grace that came from being fully accepted by the ecosystem around them. Birds would land on their shoulders without fear, and dangerous animals like jaguars and venomous snakes would acknowledge them with respectful distance rather than aggression. The youngest member of their group, Yana, had developed an almost supernatural ability to find water sources and safe camping spots, as if the forest itself was guiding her steps. As they prepared to continue their journey toward the Heart Place, Kawan realized that they were no longer simply a group of indigenous activists trying to save their homeland. They had become something more powerful, a bridge between the human and natural worlds, carrying within themselves the combined wisdom of their ancestors and the living spirit of the forest. The question that remained was whether this transformation would be enough to face whatever awaited them at their destination, and whether the modern world would be capable of understanding the truths they were about to discover. On the fifth day, the travelers reached the Heart Place, and it exceeded even their most vivid spiritual expectations. The sacred site existed in a natural amphitheater formed by ancient trees, whose trunks were so massive that it would take 20 people holding hands to encircle just one of them. These weren't ordinary trees. They pulsed with a visible energy that created patterns of light and shadow that seemed to communicate in a language older than human speech. In the center of this living cathedral stood a spring of crystal clear water that bubbled up from deep within the earth, its surface reflecting not just the sky above, but also visions of the forest's past and future. Kawa approached the sacred spring with reverence, feeling the presence of countless generations of his ancestors who had made similar pilgrimages to renew their covenant with the forest spirits. As he knelt beside the water, the surface began to show him images that told the story of the original agreements between humans and the natural world. He saw his people's ancient predecessors working alongside jaguars and dolphins, tending gardens that produced abundance without destroying the ecosystem, and learning the secrets of medicine and astronomy from the trees themselves. But the visions also revealed the source of the current crisis. The spring showed him images of the corporate boardrooms where decisions were made to clear vast tracts of forest, motivated not by necessity, but by an insatiable hunger for profit that had disconnected the decision-makers from any understanding of the consequences of their actions. Kawa watched in horror as the visions showed him the true scope of the destruction planned for his region. Not just logging, but mining operations that would poison the rivers and industrial agriculture that would replace the forest's biodiversity with sterile monocultures. Marina and the other spiritual leaders of the group gathered around the spring as the water began to reveal the knowledge they had come to seek. The ancient trees surrounding them started to communicate directly, their voices creating harmonies that taught the travelers how to extend their spiritual protection far beyond their physical location. They learned that every tree in the forest was connected through an underground network of roots and fungal partnerships that could carry messages across thousands of kilometers, and that this network could be activated to create a living barrier against destruction. Young Yana, whose spiritual gifts had continued to develop throughout the journey, became the conduit through which the forest spirits shared their most powerful knowledge. Through her, the travelers learned how to create sanctuary zones, areas where the natural world itself would resist human intrusion, through methods that seemed miraculous, but were actually sophisticated applications of ecological principles. Plants would grow in ways that made machinery impossible to operate. Rivers would change course to block access roads, and the forest canopy would become so dense that satellite monitoring couldn't penetrate it. But the most remarkable revelation came when the ancient trees shared their understanding of time itself. They showed the travelers that the battle for the forest wasn't just taking place in the present moment, but across generations and centuries. Every action taken to protect the ecosystem created ripples that strengthened the spiritual defenses of the entire Amazon basin, while every act of destruction weakened the barriers that prevented total ecological collapse. The travelers realized that their small group had the potential to influence the fate of the entire planet, because the Amazon's role in regulating global climate meant that its protection was essential for all life on Earth. As the day progressed, each member of the group received specific knowledge and abilities that would help them implement the forest spirit's protection strategies. Some learned to identify the plants that could be cultivated to create natural barriers against industrial intrusion. Others gained the ability to communicate with animal species that could serve as early warning systems for threats to the ecosystem. But all of them carried within themselves a new understanding of their role as guardians of something infinitely larger and more important than any single human community. The return journey to their village took only 3 days as the forest spirits guided them along hidden paths that cut through the dense jungle with supernatural efficiency. But the travelers were no longer the same people who had left their community a week earlier. They moved with a confidence that came from carrying sacred knowledge, and the forest responded to their presence in ways that defied natural explanation. Rivers parted to create shallow crossings exactly where they needed them, and dangerous animals stepped aside with respectful acknowledgement of their transformed spiritual status. When they arrived back at Tapiri village, the logging equipment was already visible on the horizon. Massive trucks carrying bulldozers and chainsaws that would begin the destruction within days. But Kawa felt no fear as he watched the approaching machinery, because he now understood that the battle would be fought on a plain where steel and diesel fuel held no power. That evening, he gathered the entire community around the central fire and shared the knowledge the forest spirits had revealed, teaching them the ancient practices that would transform their homeland into a sanctuary that industrial forces couldn't penetrate. The implementation of the forest spirit's protection began immediately. Marina led groups of women and children in planting specific combinations of fast-growing plants that would create impenetrable barriers along the access routes the logging company planned to use. These weren't ordinary plants, but species that had been blessed by the ancient trees at the Heart Place, and they grew with impossible speed and density. Within days, the carefully planned logging roads were blocked by walls of thorny vines and bamboo groves that regenerated faster than any machinery could clear them. Meanwhile, Kawo and the village's hunters began implementing the animal communication protocols they had learned during their spiritual journey. They established contact with the forest's predator species, jaguars, ocelots, and venomous snakes, creating a network of guardians that would make it impossible for logging crews to work safely in the protected areas. The animals didn't attack humans directly, but their constant presence created an atmosphere of danger that gradually convinced the work crews to abandon their positions and request transfers to other projects. Young Yana played the most crucial role in the protection efforts, using her enhanced spiritual abilities to coordinate the underground route network that connected every tree in their territory. Through this living communication system, she could monitor the location of every piece of logging equipment and direct the forest's defensive responses with precision that amazed even the village elders. Trees would drop branches to disable machinery at critical moments, and the forest floor would become treacherously soft exactly where heavy equipment needed solid ground to operate. The logging company's attempts to complete their contract became increasingly frustrated as every aspect of the natural world seemed to conspire against their efforts. Equipment broke down with unusual frequency, access roads became impassable despite repeated clearing attempts, and workers reported an overwhelming sense of unease that made it impossible to maintain productivity. The project managers, who had never encountered anything like organized ecological resistance, began to suspect sabotage, but could find no evidence of human interference with their operations. But the most powerful aspect of the forest spirit's protection was its ability to influence the hearts and minds of the people involved in the destruction. Several logging crew supervisors began experiencing vivid dreams that showed them the consequences of their actions. Visions of poisoned rivers, extinct species, and climate disasters that would affect their own children and grandchildren. One by one, these individuals found reasons to quit their jobs or request reassignment, creating a labor shortage that made it impossible for the company to maintain their timeline. As word of the supernatural resistance spread through the regional logging industry, Kawa realized that their small community had become the center of something much larger than a local environmental conflict. Indigenous communities throughout the Amazon began sending representatives to learn about the spiritual protection methods, and environmental organizations started documenting the ecological anomalies that were occurring in their territory. The forest spirit's ancient wisdom was spreading through modern networks, creating a new form of resistance that combined traditional knowledge with contemporary activism in ways that surprised everyone involved. 6 months after the logging, company abandoned their operations. The transformation of the Tapiri community had become a model for indigenous resistance movements throughout South America. The protected forest had not only recovered from the initial damage caused by the survey crews, but had flourished beyond its original state. Trees grew larger and more vibrant, wildlife populations increased dramatically, and the river ran cleaner and fuller than the village elders could remember. But most remarkably, the spiritual practices taught by the forest spirits had awakened abilities in community members that bridged the ancient and modern worlds in unprecedented ways. Kawam found himself serving as a cultural ambassador, traveling to universities and international conferences to share the story of their successful resistance, but he was careful to explain that their victory hadn't come through confrontation or political maneuvering. It had emerged from a renewal of the sacred relationship between humans and nature that his ancestors had always maintained. "We didn't fight the destroyers," he would tell audiences of academics and activists. "We reminded the forest how to protect itself, and then we got out of the way while it did what it has always known how to do." The success of the Tapiri model attracted attention from unexpected sources. Environmental scientists began documenting the ecological anomalies that had made industrial extraction impossible, discovering that the forest's defensive mechanisms represented sophisticated applications of principles that mainstream science was only beginning to understand. The underground fungal networks, the coordinated animal behavior, and the accelerated plant growth all demonstrated forms of ecosystem intelligence that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and the natural world. Young Yana, now 9 years old, had become something of a celebrity in environmental circles, but she remained grounded in her community's traditional values. Her ability to communicate with the forest's underground networks had evolved to the point where she could monitor ecological conditions across hundreds of square kilometers, providing early warning of threats like illegal mining operations, poaching activities, and climate-related stresses. She worked closely with a growing network of indigenous children who had developed similar abilities, creating a new generation of environmental guardians who combined ancient wisdom with contemporary understanding. The economic impact of the forest's protection proved to be more positive than anyone had anticipated. Ecotourism brought sustainable income to the community as researchers and spiritual seekers came to learn about their methods. Medicinal plants that thrived under the spiritual protection protocols yielded compounds that pharmaceutical companies were eager to purchase through fair trade agreements that respected indigenous intellectual property rights. Most importantly, the restored ecosystem services, clean water, carbon sequestration, and climate regulation provided benefits that extended far beyond the community's immediate territory. But the most profound transformation was in the community's understanding of their own power and purpose. The journey to the Heart Place had revealed that they weren't simply victims of industrial expansion, but active participants in a planetary system that required their knowledge and protection to survive. Children who had once dreamed of leaving for the cities now saw their traditional homeland as the most important place they could possibly be. Adults who had felt helpless in the face of corporate power now understood that they possessed forms of knowledge that were desperately needed by a world struggling with environmental crisis. As Kawa stood by the sacred spring that had started it all, now a pilgrimage destination for indigenous leaders from across the Americas, he reflected on how completely their world had changed. The logging company's equipment had long since been reclaimed by the jungle, and their access roads had become habitats for rare species that had returned to areas they hadn't inhabited for decades. The forest spirit's call had not only saved their homeland, but had awakened a movement that was spreading throughout the indigenous world, proving that ancient wisdom and modern challenges could be addressed through forms of knowledge that honored both human needs and the consciousness of the living world. The story of the Tapiri community became more than just an environmental success story. It became proof that other ways of understanding and relating to the natural world were not only possible, but essential for the survival of both human civilization and the planetary ecosystems that supported all life on Earth. Kawa's incredible journey shows us that the most powerful solutions often come from honoring ancient wisdom in modern times. This story of spiritual resistance and ecological triumph proves that communities can protect what they love most. If this tale inspired you, subscribe for more Amazon stories that celebrate indigenous wisdom, and tell us in the comments, what would you sacrifice to protect your homeland?